He turned to his military council, an assembly of elite strategists, each representing a different vassal species of the Dominion. "These things," Sauraxis said, his voice thick with amusement, "are called humans." The chamber, filled with representatives of species that prided themselves on evolutionary perfection, collectively chittered, clicked, and rumbled with barely contained derision. The holoscreen flickered to life, displaying an anatomical breakdown of the species in question. "They lack armor plating," one general scoffed. "They require, what is this, oxygen to breathe," another sneered. "They can't even withstand a vacuum for more than a few seconds," added a strategist with incredulous disgust. One of the more biologically inclined officers, a serpentine being with for violet eyes, leaned closer. "Supreme Warlord, their bone density is troublingly low. And their musculature? Look at these readings. Some of their kind are physically stronger than others, but even their elite warriors pale in comparison to our most basic infantry units." The laughter grew. "They have no natural weapons," one of the armored warlords of the Bractal race noted, flexing his own razor-sharp claws. "No claws, no fangs, no venom sacs." Sauraxis turned, amused by his underlings' reactions. "And yet, the scouting fleet reports they resisted conquest for over 3 planetary cycles." The laughter stopped. A tense silence followed as the reality of his words settled over the chamber. No species so physiologically frail should have lasted that long against the Lorvax war machine. It wasn't as if the Dominion had been merciful. The standard planetary subjugation process had been executed with ruthless efficiency. Orbital bombardments, precision strikes against communication hubs, psychological warfare. And still, the humans fought. Sauraxis gestured toward the holoscreen again. "Observe their combat training footage." The images shifted to a battlefield. Scorched landscapes, crumbling structures, bodies littering the ground. Then came the humans. At first glance, they appeared exactly as described. Frail, small, unarmored. But something about their movements set them apart. Unlike the rigid discipline of the Lorvax legions, the humans exhibited an erratic, chaotic energy that defied logical warfare. One moment, a group of them charged into enemy fire, weaving between explosions with terrifying precision, their projectiles striking with unerring accuracy. Another clip showed a lone human soldier laughing as he tossed a small, metallic device into a fortified enemy position, only for the footage to cut out after an explosion engulfed the structure. A later recording displayed human troops improvising, using wreckage as cover, modifying enemy weapons on the fly, and even mocking their adversaries mid-combat. The assembled warlords shifted uneasily. "They adapt," muttered one. "They disobey orders," another said, scandalized. "They thrive in unpredictability," Sauraxis finished, narrowing his gaze at the images. "Yet, their physiology suggests they should be among the weakest species we've ever encountered." One of his advisors, a towering, four-armed brute of a species known as the Thulgor, crossed his arms. "With respect, Supreme Warlord, their resistance is likely a fluke. We have seen such things before. Desperate creatures fighting with reckless abandon. It never lasts." Sauraxis turned away from the holoscreen, addressing the room with a slow, deliberate nod. "Perhaps. But we shall put them to the test." The decision was made. Humans would be integrated into the Dominion's military ranks. As with all conquered species, they would serve in the armed forces, their loyalty assured through years of indoctrination and discipline. The first batch of recruits arrived within the cycle. 12 human soldiers, each hand-selected from their planet's finest military organizations, were escorted into the Dominion's most prestigious war academy. Tall, lumbering Thulgor instructors flanked them, their massive forms brimming with condescension. The human prisoners stood in loose formation, their expressions unreadable. The lead instructor, a massive, hulking brute covered in biometal armor, surveyed them with his 4 glowing red eyes. "Weaklings," he announced, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "You stand before the greatest war academy in the galaxy. Here, we forge true warriors, creatures whose very existence is a weapon. You will train alongside the finest of the Dominion's elite, but make no mistake, you will fail. You are not built for war. One of the humans, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, let out an exaggerated yawn. The Thulgor instructor stiffened. You find something amusing, primate? The human shrugged. I didn't know, man. I've had drill instructors scarier than you. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with mischief. You ever met Sergeant Miller? His comrades chuckled. The instructor's face twisted into a snarl. Enough. Training begins now. The next several weeks should have been a humiliation ritual. The human soldiers should have struggled under the Dominion's combat training. They should have faltered in the face of superior alien physiology. They should have broken. Instead, they thrived. The Dominion's training regimen relied on crushing recruits with sheer, overwhelming force, stripping them of individuality and making them a perfect cog in the machine. But humans? Humans had evolved in conflict. Their military doctrine was built on adaptability, perseverance, and an uncanny ability to function through suffering. Where other recruits collapsed from exhaustion, humans continued, grumbling, but still moving. Where alien soldiers followed rigid commands, humans improvised, sometimes to the horror of their instructors. One day, during a live combat simulation, a human soldier found himself cornered by 3 elite Lorvax warriors. The instructor overseeing the match prepared to call the battle in favor of the Lorvax, when the human threw his weapon away. Confusion flickered across the faces of the Dominion's finest. "What is he doing?" one of the instructors muttered. The answer became clear seconds later when the human tackled the largest of his opponents, twisting its weapon arm in an unnatural direction. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber. The Lorvax warrior shrieked. The 2 remaining opponents hesitated. The human, grinning despite a gash on his forehead, panted. "Oh, sorry. Thought we were supposed to win." The Thulgor instructor stared. This wasn't how combat was supposed to go. The Dominion relied on predictable engagements. Fights were determined by superior numbers, superior technology. But these creatures? They were unpredictable. More reports came in. Humans were displaying disturbing tendencies during training exercises, eating food deemed nutritionally void, thriving under stress, and even developing social bonds with species considered aggressively hostile. Then there was the incident in the weapons lab. A group of human soldiers, during an off-duty hour, had somehow modified Dominion plasma rifles to double their rate of fire, an engineering feat Dominion scientists had struggled with for decades. When confronted, one of the humans shrugged and said, "It wasn't that hard. We just figured you guys were overcomplicating it." The Dominion officers were livid. The Supreme Warlord was silent. For the first time in his long, brutal career, Sauraxis felt something gnaw at the back of his mind. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it was unease. And that was far worse. The atmosphere inside the Dominion warship was thick with the scent of burnt ozone and the low hum of machinery. Lieutenant James Jim Carter sat cross-legged on the metal floor, flicking a playing card between his fingers. Across from him, Sergeant Maria Escuela leaned against a stack of supply crates, arms crossed, chewing on a piece of dried jerky salvaged from their last meal. She hadn't spoken in 5 minutes, which meant she was thinking. That was always a bad sign. "You good, Sarge?" Jim asked without looking up. Escuela tore the jerky in half with her teeth, chewed, and swallowed before answering. "Just trying to figure out which part of this whole situation is dumber," she muttered. Corporal David Reaper Kowalski, sprawled out on a nearby cot, snorted. "Tough competition. You talking about the part where we're the only human squad in this entire war fleet? Or the part where they think we're just along for the ride?" Jim smirked, flipping the playing card onto the floor between them. "Oh, come on. What about the fact that we're technically prisoners, but they're trusting us with live ammo and combat gear?" Escuela exhaled through her nose. "Exactly my point. They don't think we're a threat. That's what gets me." From a far corner of the room, Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, the squad's designated heavy gunner, chuckled. "Let M. The best part about being underestimated is proving people wrong." The door to their barracks slid open with a sharp hiss, and an 8-foot-tall Lorvax officer stomped inside, his bioluminescent stripes flickering in what Jim had learned was irritation. "The time has come, humans," the officer rasped, his voice an unsettling mix of guttural clicks and smooth tones. "You will deploy alongside the Thulgor warriors in suppressing an insurgent rebellion on the industrial moon of Carvos 9. Your performance will determine whether your species is worth assimilating into the Dominion's greater forces or discarded as useless." Jim stood up, stretching, and shot Escuela a meaningful look. "Right. No pressure." The officer turned on his clawed feet, expecting them to follow. Escuela grunted as she grabbed her rifle. Showtime. The war zone was chaos. The Dominion's standard battle doctrine relied on overwhelming force, airstrikes, precision orbital bombardments, and ground troops advancing in rigid formations. Against most species, this worked flawlessly. Against humans, it was a glaring weakness. Jim and his squad hit the ground running, dust and debris kicking up as they took cover behind the remains of a collapsed transport pod. The battlefield stretched out before them in all directions. Dominion forces, primarily Thulgor and Lorvax infantry, were locked in heavy combat with the rebels, a ragtag force of ex-Dominion slaves and deserters. The Thulgor, massive brutes covered in organic armor, roared as they charged headfirst into enemy lines, their heavy plasma cannons spitting fire. The Lorvax, more refined in their approach, kept to formation, advancing in perfect synchronization. And then there were the humans. "All right," Jim said, pressing his back against the smoldering wreckage. "They're expecting us to fight like them. That means we do the opposite." Escuela grinned. "Good. I was getting bored of playing nice." They split up, using the ruins as cover, their movements erratic and unpredictable. While the Thulgor trudged forward in predictable patterns, the humans weaved through the chaos, exploiting blind spots, flanking enemy positions, and taking out key targets before disappearing again. A rebel sniper perched atop a high structure had been pinning down a Dominion squad for several minutes. Jim spotted him, exhaled, and fired. The sniper slumped forward, his weapon clattering to the ground. "Sniper down," he muttered into his comm. "Copy," Escuela replied. "Brooks, light up that barricade on the left. Kowalski with me. We're going to introduce these guys to controlled chaos." Brooks didn't need to be told twice. He leveled his modified Dominion heavy repeater and let loose a sustained burst of fire, tearing through enemy cover like paper. Kowalski and Escuela moved in tandem, slipping through gaps in the firefight, using explosions and enemy confusion to their advantage. A group of rebels tried to regroup behind a derelict transport. Escuela lobbed a grenade over the wreckage, casually shouting, "Catch." The explosion sent bodies flying. "Jesus, Sarge," Kowalski muttered as they moved in. Escuela just shrugged. "What?" They didn't say no grenades. From across the battlefield, the Dominion commanders were watching, and they were worried. Humans weren't just fighting well. They were winning. It defied logic. Their physiology was inferior. Their numbers were too small. And yet, their kill count was stacking higher than entire platoons of Dominion soldiers. They didn't adhere to any known combat doctrine. They adapted mid-fight, their tactics shifting as though they were operating on pure instinct. Worse, they seemed to be enjoying it. By the time the battle wound down, the humans were covered in sweat, dirt, and the acrid scent of burnt plasma. Jim wiped soot from his face with the back of his glove. "So, I think we did okay." Escuela gave him a deadpan look. "We slaughtered them, Carter." Kowalski slung his rifle over his shoulder. "Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we scared the hell out of our new alien buddies." Brooks, normally the quiet one, smirked. "Good. Maybe next time they'll stop looking at us like we're pets." They made their way back to the Dominion staging area, where a group of high-ranking officers awaited them. Their expressions were unreadable, but their silence was telling. Finally, the Lorvax officer from before, who had been so eager to dismiss them, stepped forward. His bioluminescent markings dimmed to a dull blue, a sign of deep contemplation. This was unexpected. His voice lacked the condescension it once held. Your species was presumed to be weak. This assumption was incorrect. Jim folded his arms. You don't say. The officer studied them carefully. Your tactics are undisciplined. Your methods are unorthodox. And yet, the results speak for themselves. The Dominion does not ignore success. Escuela arched her brow. So what now? The officer hesitated before speaking. Now, the Supreme Warlord must be informed. Humans may not be as insignificant as we believed. Jim exchanged glances with his team, his smirk widening. Yeah, he said, you're just figuring that out? Far above the battlefield, on the bridge of the Lorvax Dominion's flagship, Supreme Warlord Sauraxis stood before a massive, hollow display, watching the playback of the battle. His advisors surrounded him, their body language tense, their voices hushed. Their kill ratio exceeds expectations by a factor of 6, one murmured. They fought with no regard for conventional strategy, another added. Sauraxis remained silent, watching the footage of the human squad working seamlessly, their banter laced with dark humor even as they tore through the enemy. He turned to his most trusted general. I want every available record on human warfare. History, psychology, tactics. We must understand what we are dealing with. The general hesitated. Sir, if their capabilities are even half of what we have witnessed, should we not reconsider their place in the Dominion? Sauraxis narrowed his eyes. Oh, we will reconsider everything. The holoscreen flickered, freezing on an image of the humans laughing in the midst of battle. For the first time in his long reign, the Supreme Warlord felt something entirely unfamiliar crawl down his spine. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something far worse. It was unease. The Supreme Warlord Sauraxis stood at the bridge of his flagship, his claws curling and uncurling over the polished control panel. His bioluminescent skin pulsed erratically, betraying a turmoil he had never felt before. The humans had been an anomaly, an irritating, inexplicable disruption in the otherwise perfect order of conquest. But anomalies could be studied. Anomalies could be eliminated. Status report, he commanded, voice clipped. A Lorvax strategist hesitated before responding. The battle on Carvos 9 was a victory, Supreme Warlord. But not in the way we anticipated. Sauraxis's gaze snapped toward the officer. Clarify. The holoscreen flickered, displaying footage from multiple Dominion ships and ground-based surveillance. The humans were at the center of it all, their movements erratic, their tactics completely unorthodox. He watched in silent horror as they darted in and out of cover, defying every known combat principle. Where Dominion forces relied on discipline and brute force, the humans fought like living chaos. They adapted mid-battle, laughing even as they waged war. Their enemies never knew what they would do next. The worst part? Neither did the Dominion. Sauraxis's mandibles clenched. They won through disorder. A different strategist coughed uneasily. Yes, Supreme Warlord. And there is more. The footage changed to a transmission intercepted from one of the human soldiers, a recording from their personal communications. One of the human warriors, the one designated as Sergeant Escuela, had been speaking to her squad. If they're watching this, I want them to know something, Escuela said, grinning. Her armor was scuffed, and there was dried blood at her temple, but her posture was relaxed, confident. You don't win wars with technology alone. You don't win them with size or strength or even numbers. You win them by being the craziest son of a bitch on the battlefield. She leaned forward, eyes glinting. And nobody does crazy like humans. The transmission ended. Silence hung heavy in the command chamber. Sauraxis exhaled slowly. That message was not intended for U.S. No, Supreme Warlord, the officer confirmed. It was meant for the rebels. And they received it. Sauraxis closed his eyes. The implications crashed into him all at once. The Dominion had never encountered an enemy like this before. They were not simply fighting humanity. They were fighting the idea of humanity. And that was far more dangerous. Across the galaxy, the ripple effect had begun. Word of the battle spread like a wildfire through the Dominion's vassal species. Every alien race that had suffered under the iron grip of the Empire took notice. The official reports framed the humans as expendable assets, a minor footnote in the Dominion's continued expansion. But the rebels and resistance movements saw the truth. They saw an entire squad of humans outmaneuver and outgun elite Dominion soldiers. They saw a handful of inferior warriors obliterate enemy positions and laugh while doing it. And most of all, they saw a species that refused to be broken. Within days, human battle tactics were being studied in secret by rebel leaders. Groups once considered too weak to challenge Dominion rule began testing human-inspired strategies: ambushes, misdirection, psychological warfare. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting control over their empire, and now, with every passing moment, they were losing it. But the humans? The humans were thriving. Jim Carter sat inside a stolen Dominion transport, feet propped up on a crate of stolen supplies, listening to the panic chatter across enemy comm channels. The Dominion's forces were fracturing, their morale crumbling. "Sounds like they're finally getting the memo," Kowalski muttered, checking his rifle. Carter grinned. Took him long enough. Across the cramped interior of the transport, Escuela finished reloading her weapon. "They underestimated us, and now they're afraid. Fear makes people stupid." Brooks, the heavy gunner, nodded. "And scared soldiers don't win wars." The transport jolted as they entered a new planetary orbit, preparing for their next deployment. This time, the humans weren't being sent to fight under Dominion command. This time, they were leading the charge. The rebels had reached out, tentatively at first, then eagerly. Human soldiers had been drafted into resistance movements across Dominion-controlled worlds. They taught insurgents how to fight dirty, how to use the natural arrogance of their oppressors against them. On the planet Draxus 4, human soldiers introduced a local resistance force to the art of psychological warfare. The Dominion relied on strict chain-of-command structures, so the rebels, under human guidance, targeted their officers first. With their leadership in chaos, entire Dominion battalions collapsed without a single full-scale engagement. On Volrith Prime, a planet long considered a Dominion stronghold, a group of human-trained rebels staged an uprising inside a Dominion barracks. The official report classified it as a catastrophic internal failure. But those who had been there knew the truth. They hadn't just been trained by humans. They had become human in spirit. Salraxis watched it all unfold from his throne room, his fingers tapping against the armrest in calculated deliberation. He had fought thousands of battles, crushed countless civilizations, but never had he seen a species spread like a wildfire of chaos. His advisors had begged for immediate countermeasures. Some argued for the complete extermination of the human species, but the warlord knew it was too late for that. Humanity had already infected the very fabric of the Dominion's empire. Killing them wouldn't erase their influence. And now, for the first time in Dominion history, there was no clear path to victory. Salraxis studied the latest intelligence reports, his mind spinning through the possibilities. If humanity could not be eradicated, could it be controlled? He turned to his most trusted general. "Send a message to the human squad," he ordered. "Tell them we request a meeting." His general hesitated. A diplomatic negotiation? No. Salraxis's eyes burned with intensity. A ceasefire. A pause. "Sir." The supreme warlord of the most feared empire in the galaxy exhaled, his pride battling against his pragmatism. "If we cannot defeat them," he said finally, "we must learn from them." And for the first time in recorded history, the Dominion extended its hand in truce. Carter stared at the encrypted message blinking on his communicator, Escuela reading over his shoulder. The message was simple, yet unbelievable. The Dominion, the great Lorvax war machine, wanted to talk. Kowalski let out a low whistle. "Well, damn. We broke 'em." Escuela shook her head, her expression unreadable. "No. We changed them." Carter smirked, pocketing his communicator. Same thing, really. As their transport descended toward the negotiation site, one thought echoed through every human soldier's mind. They hadn't just fought a war. They had rewritten the rules of the entire galaxy. The supreme warlord Sauraxis stood at the edge of the throne chamber, his gaze fixed on the massive viewport overlooking the Dominion's capital world. Beneath him stretched a planet of perfect order, towering spires, regimented streets, and the synchronized movements of soldiers who had never known defeat. Until now. Behind him, his most trusted generals stood in rigid silence, their bioluminescent skin dimmed in unease. They had gathered here to discuss strategy, to find some way to contain the madness that had begun spreading across the Dominion like a virus. But the air was heavy, charged with something that none of them wanted to name: fear. Sauraxis turned slowly. The humans have agreed to meet. The words felt wrong in his mouth. He had never needed to negotiate before. The Dominion did not ask for parley. It did not compromise. It conquered. And yet, here he was, preparing to speak with an enemy that refused to be defeated. One of the generals, a scarred veteran of countless campaigns, stepped forward hesitantly. "Supreme Warlord, I must object. We do not negotiate with primitives." Sauraxis regarded him coldly. "They are no longer primitives. They have rewritten the very nature of war in our domain. They did not match us in strength, yet we are the ones retreating. They did not match us in technology, yet we are the ones struggling to adapt. Tell me, General, who is the inferior species now?" The general's mandibles clicked shut. No one spoke after that. The meeting was arranged in neutral space, aboard a derelict station floating in the void between Dominion and human-controlled territories. Once a forgotten outpost, it now served as the stage for an event that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The humans arrived in a stolen Dominion shuttle, their landing smooth, unhurried. When the doors hissed open, they did not march out in disciplined lines like Dominion officers. They strolled, weapons slung casually over their shoulders, smirking as if they had just stepped into a roadside diner instead of the most important negotiation in intergalactic history. Jim Carter led the way, his gait relaxed, but his eyes sharp. Sergeant Escuela flanked him, her expression unreadable, while Brooks and Kowalski walked just behind, whispering jokes under their breath. Sauraxis watched them approach with the same wary curiosity a scholar might afford a venomous creature they did not yet understand. They were so small compared to the Dominion warriors that stood at attention behind him, so weak-looking, and yet they had brought an empire to its knees. The chamber fell into silence as Carter stopped before the Supreme Warlord's throne. He let the moment stretch, dragging out the tension like a seasoned performer. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of gum, unwrapping it with deliberate slowness before popping it into his mouth. Sauraxis's fingers curled against the armrest of his throne. "Do you mock me?" Carter exhaled, letting the silence build. Then he smiled, slow and easy. "No, Supreme Warlord. I just figured if we're going to have a talk, I may as well be comfortable." The Dominion officers bristled. One of them stepped forward, voice tight with fury. "You are speaking to the ruler of the greatest empire in the known universe. Show respect." Carter turned to Escuela. "Do you think we should show respect?" Escuela tilted her head. "To the guys who tried to kill us? Jury's still out." The Supreme Warlord exhaled, forcing himself to suppress the creeping frustration. Humans were infuriating. They treated war like a game, diplomacy like a comedy act. And yet, despite their irreverence, they were standing here, on equal footing with the mightiest force in the galaxy. "Enough," Sauraxis said finally, his voice cutting through the tension. "You have forced my hand. The Dominion acknowledges your people as significant." "That's a fancy way of saying we admit you kicked our asses," Kowalski murmured, just loud enough for the Dominion officers to hear. Brooks snorted. Sauraxis's glare could have shattered glass. "We are prepared to offer peace," Sauraxis continued, choosing to ignore the comment. "An end to hostilities." Carter chewed his gum thoughtfully. "See, that's interesting," he said. "Because last I checked, we weren't the ones losing sleep over this war. You want peace? Sure. But what are you offering in return?" Sauraxis narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" The humans exchanged glances. Escuela shrugged. A lifetime supply of beer, Kowalski added, and better food rations. You guys have, like, zero flavor in your diet. Brooks leaned in. Also, can we talk about personal space? Because I swear to God, your officers hover way too much. Salraxis's jaw tightened. Enough games. Carter's smirk faded. You're right. Enough games. He stepped forward, voice dropping into something calm, measured, and dangerously sharp. What we want is freedom. Not just for us, but for every species under your rule. The Dominion ends its conquest, dismantles its forced labor colonies, and lets every civilization decide its own future. That's the deal. A ripple of unease swept through the Dominion officers. Salraxis stared at the human soldier, searching for any trace of hesitation, of weakness. He found none. If we refuse? Salraxis asked. Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it this time. Then we keep doing what we do best. And trust me, Supreme Warlord, you haven't even seen us at full strength yet. Salraxis knew a bluff when he saw one. This was not a bluff. For centuries, the Dominion had crushed rebellions with ease, their overwhelming force snuffing out uprisings before they could take root. But this was different. The humans hadn't just resisted the Dominion. They had infected it with something far worse than defiance. Hope. Already, reports flooded in from across the Empire. Entire species rising up, Dominion forces refusing orders, planets declaring independence. And, at the center of it all, these creatures. These laughing, unpredictable, ridiculous creatures. Salraxis could see the future unfolding before him. And for the first time in his long reign, he saw a battle he could not win. Silence stretched between them. The air in the chamber felt thick, electric. Then, at last, Salraxis exhaled. Very well. The chamber went deathly quiet. We accept your terms, the Supreme Warlord said. The words felt foreign wrong, but undeniable. The Dominion will withdraw from all occupied territories. The war is over. A slow grin spread across Carter's face. Good choice. The Dominion officers looked as though they had been struck, their bodies rigid with disbelief. But they said nothing. They knew, they all knew, there had never been another option. Salraxis stood from his throne, his imposing form casting a long shadow over the chamber. You humans, he said, studying them, are the greatest threat the Dominion has ever faced. Carter shrugged. Yeah, we get that a lot. The Supreme Warlord turned, giving one final glance at the once great war machine he had built, now unraveling before his very eyes. Then, without another word, he walked away. The humans watched him go, the weight of their victory settling over them. Did we just win? Kowalski asked after a beat. Escuela crossed her arms, smirking. We didn't just win. We broke an empire. Carter exhaled, popping another stick of gum into his mouth. Damn right we did.